certainly peace is possible between Ukraine and Russia if Russia stops its offensive operations into Ukraine and stops bombing Ukraine many times each 24-hour period. There's no question about who the aggressor is here. There's no question that this was not provoked by anything that Ukraine did or it threatened Russia in any way. In fact, if you look at the terms that President Zelensky offered in the weeks prior to the full-on invasion in February 2022, it had agreement to not seek NATO membership, agreement on a variety of other issues and terms that would have been advantageous to Russia. The bottom line is that Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine has a right to exist as a sovereign state, that believes it is part of Russia. Keep in mind always what Vladimir Putin said when he was asked what was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he had a lot to choose from: World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. And he answered the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that gives huge insights into his objectives, into his frankly twisted, revanchist, revisionist view of history. I think his terms are absolutely unacceptable to Ukraine. And again, keep in mind, this is not just about the US and Russia negotiating. At the end of the day, Ukraine has to agree, and they may not agree if the agreement prohibits them, for example, from continuing to build their military, demands demilitarization, neutrality, any of these issues. And Ukraine can continue to fight on, especially if the EU increases its support for Ukraine a reasonable amount. What Ukraine is doing with unmanned systems, for example, is absolutely cutting edge. Nowhere else in the world are militaries doing what Ukraine is doing. And I was just there, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the reasons for being there was a huge gathering, a conference organized by Brave One, which is a company supported a bit by the Ukrainian government to facilitate investment from outside in cutting edge Ukrainian technologies, particularly unmanned systems, and not just in the air, but also at sea. That's what has sunk 1/3 of the Black Sea fleet of Russia without Ukraine even having a navy to speak of. And then also increasingly ground robotic unmanned systems as well, an increasing amount of their logistics. So taking supplies, ammunition, food, fuel, water forward to the elements in the front lines, and then taking back casualties and so forth as well. An increasing amount of that is being done with unmanned systems remotely piloted. And what Ukraine is doing, again, in this area is just not being done anywhere else in the world. If the EU can help Ukraine continue that effort, that's what is enabling Ukraine, which is heavily outnumbered on the front lines and heavily outgunned. That's what enables Ukraine to prevent all but incremental gains on a daily basis by Russia. Yes, they do continue. Yes, they are worrisome. Yes, there could be a breakthrough somewhere. But by and large, that has not been the case. In fact, Russia can't really even conduct combined arms operations. In other words, tanks, infantry, and infantry fighting vehicles, engineers, and the other elements that comprise that kind of mechanized offensive. They can't do that because the no man's land is so lethal. The drones are over it constantly. And the moment the Russians make a move, they launch a number of additional drones, and then they just take out these systems. So Ukraine could definitely fight on. I think they would fight on if the agreement is not sufficient for their interests, for their very survival, to have penalties for Russia if they violate a ceasefire. And I think the big question of the day is whether or not there will be an adequate security guarantee. This is a very thorny problem. I don't think that we can expect to see EU forces, or much less American forces, on the front lines, which would be the ultimate guarantee, as you see in Korea for many, many decades, where US forces are very close to the demilitarized zone. And it's actually a 4-star American commander who oversees all of the different forces on the Korean Peninsula in the south. Peacekeepers, I don't know what that really means in this case. They wouldn't be keeping the peace. The minute the Russians stop violating the ceasefire agreement, peace will break out. This is not like Bosnia, where you have Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. And I served there for a year. And by the way, a great Italian contingent there. This is not like that situation where you literally did have to have a force that could ensure that that the warring factions didn't begin shooting at each other again. It's not like Haiti, where I was the chief of operations for the United Nations mission, where there are a number of very serious gangs and criminal elements that needed to be subdued and cowed, actually. This is a situation where you need to have a retaliatory force, a force that can hammer Russia if it violates the ceasefire. That's a big commitment. It would be one that, to be effective, would have to consist of some very substantial capabilities in terms of air power, as I noted earlier, in the states around Ukraine, the Baltic states, Eastern Poland, perhaps Romania, and others. And you'd have to have quite an architecture over top of that. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. You'd have to have the refuelers. That's another area, the aerial refueling. It's another area in which the U.S. has a vast capacity, much greater than that of all of the EU put together, and on and on. So the real question here, in particular for the Europeans, because this will not be a NATO operation. I think that Hungary or some other country might prevent it from being a NATO operation. And if it is the Europeans without the U.S., what would that retaliatory capability be? And would the political authorities truly agree to carry out such an operation if the Russians violate the ceasefire? So very important for the U.S. to put this forward. I very much sympathize with President Trump's desire to see the killing and damage and destruction stop. But it has to be done in a way that allows Ukraine to be ready in the future if Russia just takes advantage of the 2 or 3 year break to rearm their forces, noting that they've gone through a huge percentage of their armored capabilities and other systems that, as I noted earlier, are so very vulnerable when they come out from hiding and actually begin to attack the Ukrainian forces on the ground.